When German tanks rolled across the Polish border in September 1939, the world witnessed what appeared to be an unstoppable military machine. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics shattered armies in weeks, sometimes days. Poland fell in a month. Denmark capitulated in hours. Norway, despite British intervention, collapsed in weeks. France, the mighty victor of the previous war, surrendered in 6 weeks. By the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany dominated Europe from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. But this spectacular string of victories masked a fundamental truth that would ultimately doom the Third Reich. Germany was never economically prepared for the war it started. The blitzkrieg wasn't just a revolutionary military doctrine born from brilliant tactical thinking. It was an economic necessity, a strategy forced upon Germany by resource constraints so severe that prolonged warfare was simply impossible. The German economy in 1939 was in many ways a facade. Despite years of rearmament under Hitler, despite the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia, despite the propaganda images of endless columns of tanks and aircraft, Germany lacked the fundamental resources required for modern industrial warfare. The Reich had no significant domestic oil production. Its iron ore reserves were limited and of low quality. It produced no natural rubber. Its agricultural sector, even in peacetime, couldn't feed its population without imports. Hitler and his economic planners understood this vulnerability acutely. The entire Nazi economic strategy was built around a concept called Wehrwirtschaft, or defense economy, but it was a defense economy with a fatal flaw. Germany was preparing not for total war, but for a series of short, decisive campaigns. The stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, and supplies were calculated to last months, not years. The industrial mobilization was geared toward equipping the military for quick strikes, not sustaining a grinding conflict of attrition. This is why the blitzkrieg had to work. German planners calculated their fuel reserves in weeks of combat operations. When tanks raced across France, they were burning through Germany's strategic petroleum reserves at an alarming rate. Victory had to come before the tanks ran dry, before the ammunition stocks depleted, before the economic contradictions of the Nazi war machine became impossible to ignore. The early conquests provided temporary solutions to these structural problems. Each invasion was, in essence, an economic raid as much as a military operation. Austria brought gold reserves and some industrial capacity. Czechoslovakia delivered the Skoda Arms Works, one of Europe's premier weapons manufacturers, along with stockpiles of weapons and ammunition that would prove crucial in the early war years. Poland provided agricultural land and labor. France offered Europe's second-largest industrial base, along with iron ore from Lorraine. But the most critical acquisition was Romania. The Ploesti oil fields became Germany's lifeline, providing roughly 60% of the Reich's petroleum needs. Without Romanian oil, the German war machine would have ground to a halt within months. This dependence shaped German strategic thinking throughout the war. It was no coincidence that Hitler's primary objectives in invading Soviet Union was securing the oil fields of the Caucasus. Germany didn't just want Soviet oil, it desperately needed it. The conquest of Western Europe created an illusion of plenty. Warehouses in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands held years' worth of supplies. German forces captured vast quantities of weapons, vehicles, trucks, and equipment. The Wehrmacht would use French trucks and captured Soviet equipment throughout the war, not by choice, but by necessity.
German industry simply couldn't produce enough vehicles to meet demand.
Yet even at the height of German power in 1940, the economic warning signs were unmistakable to those who looked. Food rationing had begun in Germany immediately upon the outbreak of war. Butter, meat, and eggs were strictly controlled. This wasn't a temporary wartime measure. It reflected the fundamental inadequacy of German agricultural production. The Reich required food imports to feed its population, and war disrupted those imports severely. Steel production, the backbone of any industrial war effort, faced constant shortages. Germany produced roughly one-third the steel of the United States and significantly less than the Soviet Union. Every tank built meant fewer ships constructed. Every artillery piece forged meant less steel for aircraft production. The German economy was engaged in a constant zero-sum game of resource allocation, robbing Peter to pay Paul, never able to build enough of anything. The synthetic fuel program, one of Nazi Germany's most ambitious industrial projects, highlighted both German ingenuity and desperation. Through the Fischer-Tropsch process, Germany could produce gasoline and diesel from coal, of which it had abundant reserves. By 1944, synthetic plants provided over 90% of Germany's aviation fuel. But these plants were enormously expensive, resource-intensive, and inefficient. They required vast amounts of coal, water, electricity, and skilled labor. Most critically, they couldn't produce enough. German fuel production never met demand, not even close. The labor situation compounded every other problem. Modern industrial warfare requires millions of workers to feed the war machine. But Germany also needed millions of soldiers at the front. Unlike the Soviet Union with its vast population, or America with its immigration-fed workforce, Germany's population of 70 million couldn't provide both. The solution was slave labor, millions of prisoners and forced workers from occupied territories. By 1944, foreign workers constituted a quarter of Germany's workforce. This system was not only morally abhorrent, but economically inefficient. Slave labor is poorly motivated, prone to sabotage, and requires extensive supervision. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the economic timer was already ticking. The blitzkrieg in the East had to succeed quickly for the same reasons previous campaigns had to be swift. Germany couldn't afford a long war. The fuel reserves were calculated for a campaign lasting through autumn. The ammunition stockpiles were built for decisive battles, not years of attrition. The agricultural planning assumed Ukrainian grain would be flowing to Germany by harvest time. When Soviet resistance didn't collapse as anticipated, when Moscow didn't fall before winter, when the Red Army kept fighting despite catastrophic losses, Germany's economic house of cards began to tremble. The Reich had conquered half a continent, but was already running out of everything it needed to hold it. The illusion of strength was giving way to the reality of inadequacy. The war of annihilation Germany launched would ultimately annihilate Germany itself, crushed not just by enemy armies, but by the mathematical impossibility of sustaining total war without the resources to fight it. The German invasion of the Soviet Union began on June 22, 1941, with the largest military operation in history. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 750,000 horses, and 3,500 tanks surged across a 1,000-mile front. In the first weeks, the advance seemed unstoppable. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Millions of prisoners were taken. Cities fell.
The Wehrmacht drove hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, and Hitler confidently predicted victory before winter. But Operation Barbarossa wasn't just a military gamble. It was an economic death spiral disguised as conquest. Every mile the Germans advanced deeper into Russia stretched supply lines that were already inadequate. Every battle consumed ammunition, fuel, and equipment at rates that German industry couldn't replace. Every week of continued resistance by the Red Army drained reserves that were supposed to last only through autumn. The Eastern Front didn't just fight the war, it consumed the entire German war economy and demanded more than could ever be supplied. The scale of consumption on the Eastern Front defied all pre-war calculations. A single German infantry division required approximately 30 tons of supplies per day during active operations. An armored division needed 300 tons daily. Multiply those numbers by hundreds of divisions spread across the vast expanses of Russia, and the logistical nightmare becomes clear. The German railway system, which worked efficiently in Western Europe with its dense rail networks, collapsed under the strain of Russian distances and Soviet sabotage. The Soviet railway system used a different gauge than European railways, meaning German trains couldn't simply roll east. Every rail line had to be converted, a process that required massive amounts of labor, materials, and time. Meanwhile, supplies piled up hundreds of miles behind the front lines. Trucks that were supposed to deliver ammunition and fuel instead sat broken down on primitive Russian roads. The horses, which actually moved most German supplies, consumed more fodder than could be transported forward. By winter 1941, German soldiers were starving, not because Germany had no food, but because they couldn't get food to the front. The Battle of Stalingrad illustrated the consumption spiral at its most devastating. From August 1942 to February 1943, the Germans poured men and material into the ruins of a single city. The battle consumed entire armies. The Sixth Army alone numbered over 250,000 men when encircled. The Luftwaffe attempted a massive airlift, but the supply requirements exceeded air capacity by an order of magnitude. Each day, the encircled troops needed 700 tons of supplies. The Luftwaffe managed, on its best days, to deliver 200 tons. Aircraft were shot down, fuel ran short, and winter weather grounded planes. The soldiers inside the pocket starved, froze, and ran out of ammunition. But Stalingrad's consumption didn't end with the encircled army. The relief attempts consumed additional divisions, thousands of tanks, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The battle devoured more resources than the entire French campaign of 1940. And Stalingrad was just one battle among dozens raging simultaneously along a front stretching thousands of miles. Kursk would prove even more costly. Each defensive line the Soviets built required the Germans to expend more artillery shells, more tank rounds, more fuel, and more lives to break through. The Eastern Front's appetite was insatiable, and it warped the entire German economy. Albert Speer, appointed armaments minister in 1942, performed near miracles of industrial reorganization. German war production actually peaked in 1944, years into the war, through rationalization, standardization, and ruthless prioritization. Yet even at peak production, Germany never built enough of anything. The gap between frontline needs and industrial capacity grew wider, not narrower. Consider tank production. Germany produced approximately 25,000 tanks and assault guns during the entire war. The Soviet Union built over 80,000. Even accounting for quality differences, the disparity was overwhelming. Each German panzer was a masterpiece of engineering, complex and capable. But complexity meant longer production times, more specialized parts, more maintenance requirements, and more ways for things to break. When a Tiger tank broke down in the Russian steppe, it often had to be abandoned because spare parts couldn't reach it, or recovery vehicles couldn't tow it, or mechanics lacked the specialized knowledge to repair it.
The Luftwaffe faced similar mathematics of inadequacy. German aircraft production increased dramatically through the war, but pilot training collapsed. Fuel shortages meant new pilots received minimal flight time before being thrust into combat against veteran Allied aviators who had hundreds of hours of training. The result was predictable slaughter. By 1944, the average life expectancy of a new German fighter pilot was measured in missions, not months. Germany was building aircraft faster than it could train pilots, and losing both at rates that made victory impossible. The Allied bombing campaign accelerated the consumption spiral in ways both obvious and subtle. The direct destruction of factories, refineries, and infrastructure was significant but not decisive. More important was the forced dispersal of German industry. To protect against bombing, factories were scattered, moved underground, or relocated to occupied territories. This dispersion reduced efficiency dramatically. A concentrated factory complex with integrated production could build tanks or aircraft far more efficiently than scattered facilities connected by vulnerable transportation networks. Bombing also forced Germany to divert enormous resources to air defense. By 1944, Germany deployed more artillery pieces for anti-aircraft defense than for ground operations. Tens of thousands of skilled workers manned flak batteries instead of working in factories. Over 1 million people were employed in air raid protection, rubble clearing, and reconstruction. Fighter aircraft that could have supported ground operations instead defended the homeland. The Reich was consuming itself, defending against consumption. The synthetic fuel program, Germany's answer to oil dependency, became both salvation and millstone. The massive plants at Luna, Perlitz, and elsewhere represented billions of Reichsmarks in investment and consumed vast quantities of coal and electricity. When the Allies finally targeted these plants systematically in 1944, the results were catastrophic. German fuel production plummeted. Training flights were canceled. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel. The Luftwaffe was grounded not by lack of aircraft, but by empty fuel tanks. Agricultural collapse compounded military defeat. German-occupied territories were supposed to feed the Reich, but occupation created its own consumption spiral. Millions of soldiers required feeding. Partisan warfare disrupted farming. Soviet scorched earth tactics destroyed infrastructure. The brutal occupation policies turned potential collaborators into resistance fighters. Ukrainian grain that was supposed to flow to Germany never materialized in expected quantities. By 1944, German civilians were subsisting on rations that barely prevented starvation, while soldiers at the front received even less. The labor crisis became existential. Every casualty on the Eastern Front wasn't just a lost soldier, but a lost worker. Germany couldn't replace both. The solution was expanded use of slave labor, eventually totaling over 7 million foreign workers and prisoners. But slave labor sabotaged production, worked slowly,
required extensive supervision, and lacked the skills for complex manufacturing. A factory staffed with motivated, skilled German workers might produce twice as much as one staffed with resentful, malnourished prisoners. The consumption spiral fed on itself in a vicious cycle. Battles consumed resources, requiring more production. More production meant more workers, meaning fewer soldiers. Fewer soldiers meant longer battle lines, more consumption. More consumption depleted stockpiles faster, creating shortages. Shortages reduced combat effectiveness, prolonging battles. Prolonged battles consumed more resources. Round and round the spiral went, tightening like a noose around the German war economy. By late 1943, the spiral had become irreversible. Germany was losing the war of production, not because German workers were less skilled or German engineers less clever, but because the consumption on the Eastern Front exceeded any possible production capacity. The Soviets could trade space for time, absorb horrific casualties, and keep fighting because their industrial base was beyond German reach and supplied by American Lend-Lease. Germany had no strategic depth, no untapped reserves, no overseas empire to draw upon. The Eastern Front consumed everything Germany had and demanded more. It consumed armies, equipment, fuel, food, and hope. It consumed the myth of German military invincibility. Most critically, it consumed time, the one resource Germany could least afford to lose. Every month the war continued was a month America built more bombers, the Soviets trained more soldiers, and the British Empire mobilized more resources. Germany was trapped in a consumption spiral it couldn't escape, fighting a war of attrition it couldn't win, consuming itself in the desperate attempt to avoid the inevitable. By the beginning of 1944, the outcome of World War II was no longer in doubt to anyone capable of reading production statistics. The numbers told a story of inevitable defeat more clearly than any battlefield report. The combined industrial output of the Allied powers had created a material advantage so overwhelming that no amount of tactical brilliance, no wonder weapon, no fanatical resistance could overcome it. Germany wasn't just losing, it was being buried under an avalanche of steel, aluminum, fuel, and explosives that grew larger every month. The disparity in production was almost incomprehensible. In 1943 alone, the United States produced more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American factories built 85,000 aircraft that year, while Germany produced 25,000. The Soviet Union, despite having lost vast territories and millions of workers, outproduced Germany in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Britain, though smaller and heavily bombed, maintained production levels that exceeded Germany's in several categories. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Germany was fighting enemies who collectively could outproduce it by factors of 5, 10, or even 20 to 1, depending on the category. Consider aircraft production, where the numbers became particularly stark. In 1944, American factories delivered approximately 96,000 aircraft. The Soviet Union produced around 40,000. Britain added another 26,000. Germany, despite Speer's production miracles, built about 40,000. The Allies were producing 4 aircraft for every German plane, and this ratio actually understated the disparity because Allied aircraft were increasingly complex, heavily armed bombers and long-range fighters, while Germany was forced to focus on defensive fighters and ground attack aircraft. Tank production told a similar story of arithmetic doom. The Soviet T-34, derided by German tankers as crude and unsophisticated, rolled off assembly lines at rates that made German production look artisanal. A T-34 required approximately 3,000 man-hours to build. A German Panther needed 55,000 man-hours. A Tiger took even longer. Yes, the German tanks were superior in armor, firepower, and optics, but superiority meant nothing when facing 10-to-1 numerical odds. For every Tiger that destroyed 5 or even 10 enemy tanks, there were still Soviet tanks remaining to overwhelm it. The Germans understood these mathematics and responded with a philosophy of quality over quantity taken to self-defeating extremes. Each successive German tank design became more complex, more powerful, and more resource-intensive. The Panther, Tiger, King Tiger, and various tank destroyers represented pinnacles of engineering achievement. They were also symptoms of strategic desperation. Germany was trying to use engineering excellence to compensate for industrial inadequacy, building individual weapons so superior they could defeat multiple enemies. But the strategy couldn't work because the numerical disparity kept growing. The Wonder Weapons program epitomized this desperation masquerading as innovation. The V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, represented an extraordinary technological achievement. It was also a catastrophic waste of resources. Each V-2 cost as much as a bomber aircraft, required rare materials, including vast amounts of ethanol for fuel, and carried a warhead smaller than conventional bombs. The entire V-2 program consumed resources that could have built thousands of fighter aircraft that might have actually defended German cities against Allied bombers. But conventional weapons couldn't change the mathematics of defeat, so Germany pursued wonder weapons that couldn't either, but looked more impressive.
The jet aircraft program followed similar patterns. The Me-262 was genuinely revolutionary, faster than any Allied fighter, and potentially war-changing if deployed in sufficient numbers early enough. But Germany lacked the industrial capacity, fuel, and trained pilots to exploit the technology. The few Me-262s that entered service were too little, too late, and often grounded by fuel shortages or destroyed on the ground by Allied fighters. Innovation without adequate resources is merely expensive failure. American productivity represented something Germany simply couldn't comprehend or counter. The United States entered the war with enormous untapped industrial capacity and vast natural resources. American factories could expand without fear of bombing. American workers were well-fed, well-paid, and motivated. American agriculture produced massive surpluses that fed not just America, but also Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. By 1944, America was producing so much war material that bottlenecks occurred not in factories, but in shipping capacity to deliver everything to the war zones. The Allied logistics advantage compounded the production advantage. American trucks, produced in the hundreds of thousands, gave Allied armies mobility that Germany couldn't match. The famous Red Ball Express supplied Patton's armies across France using 6,000 trucks in continuous operation. Germany had nothing comparable. Soviet logistics, while crude, operated beyond the reach of German interdiction. American Liberty ships, mass-produced in weeks rather than months, replaced losses faster than U-boats could sink them.
Germany's submarine force, once the terror of the Atlantic, had become a one-way death trap for their crews, unable to cope with Allied radar, aircraft, and escort carriers. The oil situation crystallized Germany's hopeless position. By 1944, Allied bombing had systematically destroyed German synthetic fuel production. The Ploiești refineries in Romania, Germany's primary natural oil source, came under sustained attack and were eventually lost when Romania switched sides. Germany's fuel production collapsed from already inadequate levels to catastrophic shortage. Training flights stopped. Tanks were abandoned when they ran out of fuel rather than from combat damage. The Luftwaffe had aircraft but couldn't fly them. The Wehrmacht had vehicles but couldn't move them. The contrast with Allied fuel abundance was stark. American motorization depended on vast oil reserves in Texas, California, and Oklahoma, plus imports from Venezuela and the Middle East. The Soviets had Baku and oil fields beyond the Urals. Neither faced anything resembling fuel shortages. Allied tanks, trucks, and aircraft operated with fuel supply as a minor logistical consideration, rather than an existential crisis. German forces in the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive, literally planned their advance around capturing Allied fuel depots because Germany couldn't supply adequate fuel for the operation. Food scarcity added another dimension to collapse. By 1944, German rations had fallen to near starvation levels. Bread was mixed with sawdust and other fillers. Meat appeared rarely. Vegetables were scarce. The civilian population was slowly starving, while soldiers at the front subsisted on inadequate rations that sapped strength and morale. Meanwhile, American soldiers enjoyed rations so abundant they often threw away food. Soviet soldiers, despite their nation's suffering, received adequate nutrition to sustain combat operations. The caloric disparity between Allied and German soldiers represented another mathematical advantage for the Allies.
The manpower crisis reached breaking point. Germany had mobilized virtually every able-bodied man. Boys of 16 and men of 60 served in the Volkssturm, the last-ditch militia. Women filled every possible civilian role, though Nazi ideology resisted full female mobilization until far too late. Foreign workers and prisoners provided labor, but under conditions that made them unreliable at best. Germany had exhausted its human resources, while the Soviet Union still had reserves to draw upon, and America was shipping millions of fresh troops to Europe. German responses to these mathematical realities grew increasingly detached from possibility. Hitler ordered armies to hold positions regardless of encirclement, as if willpower could substitute for ammunition and supplies. The Wehrmacht was ordered to conduct offensives with forces that lacked the fuel to advance or the ammunition to sustain attacks. Desperate plans for new wonder weapons, super tanks, and miracle scenarios replaced rational military planning. The leadership had entered a fantasy world where determination could overcome arithmetic. The final collapse, when it came, was comprehensive. Not a single dramatic breakthrough, but systematic disintegration across every dimension. The Western Front collapsed as German armies lacked fuel to maneuver and ammunition to fight. The Eastern Front crumbled as Soviet numerical superiority became overwhelming. German cities starved as food distribution systems failed. Factories stopped producing as raw materials ran out. The railway system ceased functioning as fuel and spare parts disappeared.
The electrical grid failed as coal supplies were exhausted.